In this presentation, I want to talk about operations strategy as a very important aspect of managing operations. Actually, this happens to be one of the areas that I'm quite excited about and actually hope that you find it interesting as well. Operations strategy has to do with looking at the capabilities of the operations system within any organization and how you leverage that operation system to achieve a certain set of strategic objectives. And the part of the strategic objectives can include being competitive in a particular market or a set of markets, or it could simply be that you are a not-for-profit organization that needs to achieve a set of performance priorities. The organization has a strategy, a strategic direction, and the operation system will play a role in allowing it to achieve that. So the objectives of this presentation essentially includes providing an overview of the strategic role of operations and providing a formal process for developing an operations strategy. So those are the two principal objectives that we will get through. Let's just take a look at what strategy in an organization looks like. At the pinnacle, you have corporate strategy, which looks at the overall organization. If an organization is made up of multiple business units, as a corporation, it will have a corporate strategy, sometimes growth through acquisition, certain market shares, and so on, certain level of profitability or share price. So all of those things can be part of the sort of corporate strategy. The business strategy now, which is a level below, focuses on the different strategic business units. And so if you take a company such as Yamaha, Yamaha has all sorts of different business units. For one, you could look at the branch of Yamaha that deals with motorcycles. But then it has a music branch where it makes instruments. And so those are two different strategic business units with two different strategies. So now, if you take a given strategic business unit, such as, for example, say the music unit, then it will have it will have its own competitive strategy depending on the market that is competing in. So if we think about Yamaha pianos as an example, well, they're trying to compete with Steinway. They want to be in the upper end of the market, not competing with the low-end products. So in a case like that, their competitive strategy would have to be such that it allows them to compete effectively with people like Steinway, Boston Duffer, and so forth. Within that strategic business unit, you have now functional strategies because recall that we said most organizations have three core functions in there. One is marketing, one is the financial strategy, and one is the operations strategy. And marketing, finance, and accounting and operations. Well, if you then think of the strategies that are associated with that, we'll just simply rename them marketing strategy, financial strategy, operations strategy. Okay, so you could see where operation strategy fits into the hierarchy where you have corporate, business, and then below the business unit strategy, we have the operation strategy. And of course, those strategies, those functional strategies must be mutually reinforcing. In other words, you cannot develop an operation strategy in isolation from a marketing strategy or from a financial strategy. They should talk to each other, all right? And this is just another diagram showing you the relationship between these different levels of strategy: corporate, business, operations. And the operation strategy can be emergent in nature in the sense that as we do things in the operation system, we begin to understand the strategic significance of those things, and therefore a strategy, a particular strategy, can emerge out of what we do. Let's talk a little bit about the birth of operation strategy. It was back in 1969, a Harvard professor named Wickham Skinner was investigating why North American manufacturers were just simply not doing as good as they ought to be doing. And why there seemed to be some sort of either chaos or confusion in the manufacturing sector. And his research over a few years led to a couple of conclusions, which ultimately led to the birth of operations strategy as a subdiscipline of operations management. Well, one of the things that he discovered is that operations, and actually in his paper in 1969 he says manufacturing, but we want to generalize it because it's applicable in a general sense, that operations can be a source of competitive advantage or corporate millstone. And simply what that means is that it could either hurt you or help you. So depending on how you use operations, it could actually keep you back or it could help propel you forward. Now, if there is a link, there ought to be a link between corporate strategy and operations. If that link is not made, then your productive systems can be producing product that has nothing to do with what your strategy needs to be. So it could become non-competitive. It could become too rigid, inflexible, and therefore very difficult to change. You may not achieve the kind of performance that you're looking for from that. One of the things that Skinner discovered was that there was this traditional emphasis on cost and productivity in most systems. And so as a result, how do you bring down costs? You try to create economies of scale. And so you create larger plants, you try to produce larger volumes, longer production runs, only to realize that the longer you make your production runs, the less flexible you become. So in a market that desires flexibility, a wide variety of smaller volumes of parts, or products, then it becomes difficult to achieve that if your emphasis is on improving productivity by creating large and centralized systems just to gain economies of scale. All right? So there has to be this match between the two things. And management in the past have ignored the strategic relevance of operations and have delegated policy decisions to subordinates who have a technical focus. So that's a very crucial point, is that the people who are working on the shop floor tend to know about what they do and not necessarily think about their functions in the context of the overall corporation, supporting the overall strategy. So if you leave your decision making to folks who could only think in terms of widgets, machines, lubricants, and so on, then you're sort of limiting the strategic role of operations. And as you can see, what has happened is that management has kind of seen operations as a technical area. We don't know about this, and we should just leave that to the folks who do operations. But then when it comes to making policy decisions, these folks may have good information to provide as input, but they may not necessarily understand the implications of the policies because they're not thinking globally necessarily. Okay? So there's some implications in terms of operation strategy that different marketing strategies place different demands on operations. That's what we found out. Operations must help a company build strengths that allow it to take advantage of opportunities in the marketplace, and it must be aligned to the corporate strategy. So by its nature, operations strategy involves trade-offs, and that's one of the things that Skinner discovered, that if you want to achieve a certain performance on a particular dimension, then you may have to give up some other things. So if you want to be the best at cost, you may have to not be the best at speed. If you want to be the best in flexibility, you may not be able to be the best in delivery, and so forth. So they're performance priorities, and not that they're mutually exclusive, they exist within a system, but there's an efficiency frontier that requires some trade-offs between these various performance dimensions. All right. So designing the operation systems requires trade-offs. Necessary trade-offs will be influenced by the marketing strategy. That's why we say you cannot develop operation strategy in isolation, right? So the competitive strategy, the finance strategy, the marketing strategy all influence the operation strategy. And of course, the state of technology impacts the scope of what can be achieved at a given point in time. Nowadays, with the capabilities of information systems, we could do a lot more than what we could have done in the past. The lack of information was actually a constraint. With information now, we could do a lot of real-time management, for example, of inventory systems with given point of sales data. There's just so much more that you could do when you have a lot more information that allows you to make quicker decisions and so forth. Management must expand the notion that production facilities need only be efficient and productive. So these are like recommendations that Skinner is making. They must engage in making policy decisions about the operations. In other words, don't just leave it to the shop floor. And they must regard operations policy as an orderly process. So if there's an orderly process for operations policy, one can define a set of steps for developing an operations strategy. Okay, operations strategy is concerned with the long term. Okay, let me just backtrack a little bit. So now we get into a formal definition. How can we define operations strategy? So operation strategy is concerned with the long-term configuration of an organization's productive resources to bring about synergy between operations and corporate goals and objectives. As such, operations strategy must be aligned to the business and corporate strategy of the organization. So when it says the configuration of the productive resources, well, what are the productive resources? Productive resources include things like your equipment, your people, your location, your facilities, your layout. Well, that begins to sound like the 10 decision areas of OM, right? So another way to view it or to define it by Slack, this is taken from a text by Slack and Lewis, which says operation strategy is the decisions which shape the long-term capabilities of the company's operations and the contribution to overall strategy through the ongoing reconciliation of market requirements and operations resources. So in developing operations strategy, you must be highly cognizant of marketing requirements because ultimately operations happens to be a means, marketing requirements happen to be an end. And the two things must actually work together and be reconciled. All right? So this is just another diagram that shows we got market requirements on one end, operations resources on the other, and how we configure that to meet the market requirements would then define our operations strategy. And this just shows that the difference between operations management and operations strategy, so that we don't get the two things confused. In terms of time scale, operations management tend to focus on short-term decisions, but operations strategy looks at more long-term. Level of analysis, micro for operations management, macro for operations strategy. So we want to look at the level of the firm. Level of aggregation, fairly detailed for operations management, but a little more aggregated when we're talking about operations strategy. And then the level of abstraction tends to be a bit more concrete, a bit more philosophical in terms of operations strategy, more concrete in terms of operations management. So there's a sort of a different orientation when we talk about those two areas. All right. Remember we said that operations strategy is a sort of a reconciliation between marketing and the productive resources, operations resources. Well, let's look at marketing first, marketing perspective. What we have is typically a set of customer needs, a market position, and what competitors do. Now, in the article by Porter, when Porter talks about operations strategy, not operations, but strategy, and he talks about how strategy is not operations excellence and so forth, but he does talk about the importance of strategy as being positioning, right? Finding the right kind of positioning. And in the article, he talks about access-based, varieties-based, and so forth, right? Access, variety, and there's a third one that's just sort of skipping my mind right now. And so a needs-based, sorry, there it is. So these three represents sort of your market positioning, And depending on they work collectively, customer needs, market position, competitive actions, they then demand a certain performance, right? The performance might be in terms of speed of service, how flexible you are, the level of innovation, new product introductions, and so forth. So those performance objectives have to be met by your operations resources, all right? So here is an example: customer segmentation, age, right? So you look at youth, and then the purpose is general. Market position, well, you're going to focus on differentiation by producing innovative products, being fast to market, offering some product range, and then doing some coordinated launches. Competitors who are traditionally weak in promotion and design innovation. What are your performance objectives? You want to be dependable, you want to be fast, you want to have good flexibility, you want to be quick to market, and then you want to produce some product quality as well. Well, if you're going to do that, then you got to bring those together, all right? So what are your operations resources? Tangible and intangible resources. And the tangible resources will be like your equipment, your technology. Your intangible resources, the culture, the human resource skills and capacity, and so on. So with that, and then of course you have your processes that you've designed and your policies, and the things come together to create operations capabilities. That operations capabilities then helps us with sort of configure the operations strategy. And with the operations strategy now looks at there's some decision areas that would allow us to articulate what that strategy is. And you're familiar with the 10 decision areas of OM, which is where you could begin to articulate the strategy. So what we have here are resources, tangible equipment, staff, intangible, reputation, relationships, and so on. Capabilities, the application of leading edge lighting and sound technology. So this is an example for a lighting company. And the processes, integration of equipment, supply and client requirements, right? Design processes, supplier liaison processes, etc. So this is just samples. And then the decisions that we'll make is where you would locate, what kind of technology you would use, virtual reality technology, your development with your suppliers, being able to track your equipment, look at your org structure, configure start meetings. Well, org structure and start meetings kind of speak to some of the things you may want to do and the HR, right, in terms of strengthening your intangibles and so forth. So they come together. And they come together in this diagram that we just see here. Market requirements on one hand, so the market defining the performance objectives, your resources defining the operation strategy, and those two things must be aligned, as we could see here in this with these blue arrows, right? And if you could do that, then you get some synergies and so on. So operations has to cope with the clash between the nature of external markets and the nature of internal resources. That's what we kind of looking at in this case, right? A couple of things to keep in mind is that market requirements change all the time. They're dynamic, they can be heterogeneous and ambiguous. So we see what happened in the case of McDonald's, where market requirements became dynamic. People are seeking healthier food, and then McDonald's have to respond. But then it has to make some changes to its operations resources. Sometimes they're technically constrained. And if you think about McDonald's, where its assembly line system, a design and operating system for producing fast food, not necessarily healthy food. And so when you want to make changes to that, it's difficult to change. And there's some complexities that need to be considered. All right? And so this is just another diagram that just shows, again, what we're trying to do here. So market requirements, market may require speed, dependability, quality, flexibility, and cost. So that's performance objectives. And then, of course, our operations resources must deliver that. And we look at our capacity, our supply networks, our process technology, development, and organization. So these are the levers that we can control. Sometimes you could even try to influence the market as well. But once you understand what the market requires, then you go ahead and bring those two things together. All right? So let's pause at this juncture And when we continue, we'll begin to take a look at how to put an operation strategy together as an orderly process, and also take a look at what some well-known companies have done, because there are many companies that have done fascinating things when it comes to the use of operation strategy as a vehicle for competing.